Well, welcome to another episode of the Presbyterian and Reformed Churchman. I have two guests with me. Both have been on P&R Churchman before, and we are talking shepherding shepherds. And so let me introduce my guests first, and we'll discuss what we're going to do. But first, I'll introduce Rich Leino. Rich, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Yeah, would you remind our listeners like what church you're at, what state it is, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, Hope of Christ Church in Stafford, Virginia.
Okay, great. Oh, wait a minute. You're are you hosting GA next year?
The James River Presbytery, of which I'm a part, is hosting GA.
Okay, great. I've had Matt Fender on recently, and so I know a lot of you guys.
Yeah, Matt's a good friend.
So some powerhouse REs over there in that presbytery. And then Brad Isbell, and Brad needs no introduction, but Brad, usually you're on the other end of this where you're asking the questions. And so just remind us where you're from. What's the name of your church?
Well, I got to warn you. I usually start asking the questions, no matter whether I'm a guest.
I know.
Whether I'm running Presbycast, but I'll try to restrain myself. I'm at Covenant Presbyterian Church, PCA, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We're in the Tennessee Valley Presbytery. It's a fantastic church. I don't know of a better one. A 40-year history of solid ministers, involved ruling elders, and I couldn't be more blessed in that respect.
Praise God. Well,
and a really cool pulpit too.
Yeah, we do have one of the largest.
We have an awesome pulpit.
Yeah, we have one of the largest pulpits in the PCA. It's elevated 4 feet, 7 feet wide. Probably weighs, about a ton of oak. And there's a story behind it, but that'll be for a future show.
Wow. Well, we might have to do that. So you're saying it's bigger than the one that down in Charlotte where we were at GRN this spring?
It's probably not wider, but in a way, it's pretty visually impressive.
Wow. Okay. Well, very good. Well, the reason I've asked these gentlemen on for this discussion actually was because Brad, I know, has been instrumental in helping lure pastors to his church and shepherd pastors. And Rich is a ruling elder who he preaches, he teaches, he knows a little bit probably what it's like to be a teacher.
He exhorts. Decently in order here, George.
I'm licensed to preach, so I preach.
Okay, I stand corrected.
You were trying to correct me right off the jump, Brad. I see that. So thank you, Rich, for defending my honor and yours. But this is a topic I've wanted to talk about. This is a podcast. I bill it as a podcast with ruling elders for ruling elders. And the idea of shepherding shepherds, how ruling elders can shepherd their teaching elders and help them, protect them in some areas, maybe guide them, help them to see blind spots. And it's a tough spot to be in. And there was an article that came out a week or so ago. It was entitled Departure, Why I Left the Church. And it's this PCUSA pastor, Alexander Lang, who goes through, it says here it's a 12-minute read. So a 12-minute read of all the reasons he's left his congregation. And I think in his own words, he said, he didn't expect it to get much traction. It was more just for his own readers, maybe 100 or a couple hundred readers, but it kind of blew up the internet in the Christian world. Even in our own circles, we've seen on PCA, RE, and TE forums, all kinds of reflections on this article, this pastor's reflections on some of the frustrations of ministry. And so I thought this article would serve as a good backdrop for the congregation, for the conversation. And so, by the way, Brad, you said you like to ask questions. So what I'm hoping is you and Rich will be dialoguing such that I can almost stay out of it. But this article, Departure, Why I Left the Church, and then he wrote I guess he was interviewed on a site called Religion News, Meet the Pastor Behind That Quitting the Church essay. And so, Rich, what are some of your impressions on this article? I know you've read it. You also heard his farewell sermon. So what were some initial thoughts that jumped out at you on this?
I think it's a mixture of sort of, sadness with frustration and kind of a little bit of eye rolling at times.
Yes.
I was reflecting upon, I was actually meeting with somebody today who was the son of Iranian immigrants, grew up in D.C., and he was talking about just kind of like the way he feels like a lot of people that he tries to hire today aren't really as dedicated as he is. And we were just discussing, I guess, the way that you deal with adversity. I can't remember where I was watching it or where I was reading it, but it was kind of in a biblical counseling thing. And, adversity hits, kind of like sun on, like beating sun on something. And what determines the reaction isn't necessarily fixed based on what the adversity is. I think there's sort of the thing that struck me was, I think the way he articulated what he thought the gospel was, in terms of being vulnerable and kind of the idea of the unconditional love of God, not a sense of, well, he denies he seems to have denies the resurrection and other key tenets of the Christian faith. And so, the question is, are we dealing with ministry difficulties in the context of how somebody would delve into the resources that one has if they're united to Christ and the Holy Spirit strengthening them to that? And then, other polity matters, obviously, that go into that. Or are we dealing with somebody who's kind of, as it were, using the resources of his mind and his flesh and that sort of thing? And, that's the thing that struck me was that it's not like an apples to apples comparison. It might as well be written by, why don't we hear a testimony of how hard it was for a Mormon pastor who quit the ministry, or an imam or something like that. And there's stresses associated with leadership in general. And I could go over stresses that occurred in combat and things like that, but are they relevant to the pastoral ministry per se? So that's kind of what struck me.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Brad in a second, but just on that topic, I think that is important. I mean, this is a PC USA pastor, and we don't want to judge him, but he has put himself out there, and I think that is a very important aspect, and I think we'll probably get into that. Like, ministry is a calling; it's not a career, and what is his understanding of the gospel, and that does affect then how he views all these other stresses. But I think why the article has gained traction even in conservative evangelical circles is because, or makes it interesting, because there's a lot of supposedly confessional conservative pastors that are resonating with this piece. I was shocked to see in our own forums that, and my thing is, as I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, I have a lot of these frustrations, but I have a different grid to process it through. Brad, I want to bring you in on it. What was your impressions on what he wrote and the reaction to it?
I guess the best advice we can have for the first key for pastoral success is be a Christian. I'm not saying this man's not a Christian, but the PCUSA is barely a Christian church. There are Christians in the PCUSA, but they don't always affirm Christian doctrines, essential Christian doctrines. And the irony is, you had me on to talk about Christianity and Liberalism by Machen, and he was fighting real, gilt-edge, solid gold, certified Christian liberalism, which was denying the things that this man has come to deny. But the PCUSA itself backed away from that hardcore liberalism in the later 30s and the 40s and became more Bardian, which was nearer to Orthodox than Fosdick and some of the people that Henry Sloane Coffin and people that Machen was opposing in the 20s and in the 30s. Sounds like to me this guy's gone from being wishy-washy, not terribly confident Bardian, which is what most PCUSA ministers were up until recently. Now I don't know what they are. I mean, their religion is intersectionality and trans acceptance and things like that, eco, almost pantheistic, eco worship. But it sounds like he went from probably a Bardian. That's probably what he learned at Princeton or whatever seminary he went to being a true theological liberal who denies essential tenets like the resurrection, the divinity of Christ, I'm sure the substitutionary atonement. So, my question for you, George, if you didn't believe the Bible was true and that Christ didn't rise from the dead and that he wasn't the unique God-man, the only fitting substitute for you and for your people, I mean, why would you even bother to show up? I mean, it's sort of a heroic effort to try to do something called Christian ministry when you don't believe in Christian doctrine. So at one level, I'm glad he's quitting. I don't necessarily want his church to fail, but I sort of do because they need to go to a real church and hear a real gospel.
Yes, I was wondering, Brad, on that. You brought that up. It's funny because I was working out and I was thinking, maybe it was yesterday or today, and I was thinking, I wonder if Brad's going to connect this to Machen, and you did. You didn't disappoint. We don't have a bullhorn here, but
I know, no horn.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, the first time on P&R Churchman. Awesome.
But I was wondering. It strikes me as it could be a form of that because it's not necessarily the actual history, but the event, and it's possible he really is, but he just leaves all that historical stuff to the realm of things that we can't know. But I think your point is well taken that he could just be moving through that. But I agree. Sorry to interrupt, but the question is apt. How would you? How does a ministry get sustained? I was asking myself that question. What does somebody think they're doing in the Christian ministry, where it's all about kind of Christ as a moral example and barely mentioning his work other than kind of example, unconditional love and things like that, but more in a therapeutic context.
Right. Yeah, good point. So let me talk about some of what he highlights in the article, just so people even know what we're talking about if they hadn't read it. But he starts out by talking about how a Barna study in March of 2022 said that 42% of pastors considered quitting. And the reasons, he lists 5 reasons for this with different percentages. The immense stress of the job, being lonely and isolated, current political divisions, unhappy with the effect that his role has had on family, and not optimistic about the future of the church that the person is serving. And I think when you look at stats like that, you don't have to be a Bardian or a liberal or conservative to feel stress and lonely and division and how it's affecting the family. He goes on to list all the things that he has to be. And he says he has 1,000 bosses because of the number of the congregation and unrealistic expectations. Some of this was actually was a turnoff for me. He talked about how much time goes into an MDiv for the amount of money you get paid. Yeah. And I was just like, yeah, but you're going in the ministry. You're not going in for money. But I do get, we need a livable wage.
Well, let me jump in. He talked about, the average salary for a PCUSA pastor was $55,000. He's not making $55,000. He's probably making $155,000 with the size of his church. Right. Most PCA pastors make, our ministers average a lot more than 55,000. So I thought that was just sort of that was sort of a point scoring thing. But yeah, I think he's doing better than that. I didn't buy the money argument.
He does a lot of, in his sermon too, he likes to throw out that he attended Princeton and Oxford and all this other stuff. So there's a lot more going on there in terms of just, kind of straining his arm to pat himself on the back in terms of how impressive he thinks he is too.
Yes.
I at least that's my opinion. I mean, I just, it just didn't strike me as something that was useful. The other thing that the other part that you didn't mention that sort of bothers me, and I think this gets to your understanding of the ministry, is the kind of the burden that he felt when people were sharing things with him. And I think that if you don't have a good sense of sin, of indwelling sin, and if you don't feel like, union with Christ involves him united a sinner to himself, and you don't even hardly have categories for that, if your focus is on vulnerability and unconditional love of God, I can imagine it would be burdensome thinking about, man, look at all these people that have all these shortcomings in the church. But, my perspective on people who have sins is like, well, that doesn't really surprise me. That's sort of like who I am. Not necessarily the exact same sins, but I don't look at people sideways when they share strange things, and I don't think of it as a burden to carry these quote unquote secrets around like people that are sharing these things. I think that the hardest part I have to explain to people sometimes is for them to get over the sense in which they're somehow more despicable than the Christians around them, because I that's not my perspective on it. And it just, all of these things, and this is part of the disappointment on PCA pastors reading this and not reading between the lines and saying, why is he saying these things in this perspective? Because the numbers don't all tell a story. I mean, people are stressed out in all sorts of walks of life. And I don't mean to minimize the difficulties of the pastoral ministry, but there's a little bit of navel gazing on this to talk about this. And, it's going to be hard, and people are leaving for all sorts of reasons, but a number of reasons may be that churches are, they're off mission and they're focusing on things. And I've always believed that if you are trying to plant something or do something that's not spirit empowered, then of course you're going to get burned out if you're doing something according to the flesh.
Yeah, he doesn't have our doctrine of sin. He doesn't have our doctrine of total depravity. I mean, basically, liberal Christianity believes that people are good. It's a view of human nature much more in line with unbelievers than with the one that we should have. And it's interesting, Rich, that you talked about being surprised by sin, because I think I've written or tweeted about this recently. If you shouldn't be surprised by sin as a Reformed Christian. The doctrine of total depravity, while it's bad news, but it really ought to inform everything that we do, and we shouldn't be. I'll tell you the truth. At a point in the past in our church, we'd had some real challenges with a building, and we had to be in a temporary space, and we were trying to build a new building. But things were going great. We were growing in this hideous building that we had to rent while our new building was being built. And just everybody was happy, and we were growing in this. Again, it was just a bad situation. And I said to, my fellow elders, I said, things are going too well. I said, and I sort of predicted, 2 or 3 normal kind of sinful things that could happen, very bad things, but not unusual. And I said, I think probably within the next 3 years, all these 3 things that I mentioned are going to happen. And they did. I was not happy that my pseudo prophecy came true. And it didn't make any of that stuff any easier, but we should not be surprised by sin. I think if we're, unusually favored, we're probably being set up. When things are going too well, we should worry. We should look at ourselves. We should be happy whenever things are going well. But we need to remember that sin has not been, the penalty of sin for Christians has been canceled, but sin in the world has not been canceled. We can't make it go away by wishing it away, or, by social programs or church programs or anything else. We can have such a view of sanctification that we think there shouldn't hardly be any sin, and that's just not so. And back to the burden and the secrets thing, the ruling elders ought to know as much about what's going on in people's lives as the pastors do. Mm-hmm. I know all kinds of stuff, but I'm still happy to see people at church and talk to them, and maybe it's just me, maybe it's my personality, but some of his concerns and struggles, air quotes, didn't ring true to me.
Well, didn't So doesn't some of that also speak to, our doctrine and concept of calling? Like, first of all, it doesn't come natural to me to bear the burdens of other in my flesh, in my former life, and anything else. But I have learned there's a sweetness in that in ministry. In our church, we have there's some side wings where the seats are angled, and usually my family sits on one of those wings. And so at the times when we're singing songs, I have a view of the congregation as much as I have a view of the pulpit. And sometimes I almost, like a wave of emotion comes over me as I'm singing, people lifting voices to our Lord, knowing what each one is dealing with in their homes, in their marriages, with their parents, with their kids, in their jobs. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the Lord's people singing praises to him. And it sends like a wave of emotion over me. And it really, like, sometimes I feel bad that I'm looking at them instead of focusing on the Lord. But then I'm like, oh, the Lord is actually preparing me to preach his word to a people that I'm going to speak the good news to. And if it is a burden, but Paul talks about that in his letters too, in 2 Corinthians in particular, but bearing the burdens of what's going on in the church, and as elders, that's part of the calling, is it not?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting what you say about the singing. My pastor will sometimes just stop singing in the pulpit because we don't have a song leader. The pastor or the ruling elder is in the pulpit during the singing, and he'll just stop and listen. And he talks about how important that is to him. But that's why public worship is so important. To be together and to hear other people confess, people know better or worse than you, and to sing and to pray, and then to enjoy the Lord's Supper with people. That's a very underrated benefit. It's something you don't get on a live stream or listening to, a sermon by some great preacher while you're driving down the road. It's there's so much more to it than that.
Well, I'm glad he does that, because that makes me feel a little bit better about about my. But as I continue with this article, some of the other things he says, putting it all together as he lists a litany of different things. He says these 7 things. He's a professional speaker, a CEO, a counselor, a fundraiser, a human resources director, a master of ceremonies, a pillar of virtue, and it's all this stuff. And I'm like, I grew up in a small business. My parents ran a small business for 40 something years. I'm like, yeah, that's what a lot of even people in the world have to do when you become everything, and the solo pastor becomes everything. And we may be frustrated at some of that, and we may even think some of it is too 20th and 21st century, that it would have been simpler in the early church perhaps. But is all that part of the ministry too? Rich?
Well, pastors are not fundraisers. They shouldn't, I don't know of any pastor who thinks of themselves as a fundraiser. I mean, I don't know how it is in other churches, but our pastors don't know how much people give. I mean, the treasurers know that. The pastor is not calling up people saying, well, you were a little low this month, try to pick it up next month. It just doesn't happen. I don't get the fundraising thing. And I mean, that's a business model. It's like he's basically a Peace USA pastor is the head of a nonprofit organization, a nonprofit social organization.
Yeah.
It's not.
So did your pastor not have to do any fundraising for the building campaign or whatever you did?
No.
Well, that's great. Praise God.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, kind of like, at least zooming out a little bit, part of that issue is, again, knowing what the mission of a church is. I'm not, I was about to ask Brad to state new exceptions where he's like continuation of charismatic gifts, because he mentioned a prophecy. But I've been semi-prophesying the demise of some missional churches for some time, because when you are so focused on transformation of things that a church is not called to, and your energy is toward that, and you're not seeing that happen because the church was never called to certain things, then you're going to get burned out. And if you think that the mission of the church or the session is to do all of these things, and part of it could be just, again, a little bit of narcissism here, as if he takes credit for all these things instead of the fact that he's just kind of like, maybe as the senior pastor, part of a session too, because they haven't gotten rid of that. It may be, coming in and out, but other people are doing things. He's not doing all that. Now the pastor's probably talking to the session about some of those things that are occurring during reports. But again, your area of concern is greatly diminished when you stop thinking about all the things that are going on around you culturally or other kinds of things, if you know what the mission of the church is and what you're trying to do to shepherd your people and to bring them through and to sanctify them, to be focusing on preaching the word and the sacraments and in prayer and all those things that are means of grace, then I think that you're prone to those kinds of, burnouts, because if you think you're doing all those other things and you don't see the fruit, then that just brings frustration as well.
So I agree with all that wholeheartedly, but let me push back a little, because as I talk to other pastors, even in the PCA, particularly in solo pastor situations, which I'd love to see a study on that, if that's the majority of churches or not, but a lot, he talks about this in the context of unrealistic expectations. So I do think he often sees himself as those things, but I think maybe why this has resonated with a lot of pastors is because they get into churches and they may not have had those expectations as they stepped into a call, but the church suddenly expects those things from them. And I think there's a cumulative effect to it, right? Like, it's not any one congregant that thinks you're all 10 of these things, but it's 30 different congregants that each think you're, and there's all these overlaps, and you suddenly realize your job description is 40 things. Do you see any of that playing into this at all?
I think that happens for sure. I can't speak to every pastor's experience of churches that maybe have a weak session, poorly trained elders, don't really understand their role in terms of, providing kind of cover fire and other kinds of things, or even a strong diaconate to take care of other kinds of things and organizing properly. And then it's easy, maybe in a lazy way, to devolve on the pastor because he's the full-time hireling, as it were, that somebody might treat him like that or something like that. And I know that's not what they are. And so that certainly happens, but it's not by design, right? It shouldn't be that way. So,
right.
I can't, except I'm sure there are things that happen out there that occur where people are placed in situations where elders aren't necessarily doing their role. I think that being said, there needs to be, I think that, again, if you're not taking all the things that the person said, that at least reduces the surface area of stress, right? In terms of what he thinks he should be, because he thinks he's those things. He doesn't just say those are necessarily things that, necessarily they said, but he kind of assigns himself those roles in some ways. And that church is big enough to know that he wasn't doing all those things by himself, just locked into a room all the time doing that.
Yeah. Brad?
Let me say that I said pastors shouldn't be fundraisers. A lot of church planners are fundraisers, and they're going to take issue with my statement.
That's true.
But I don't think, well, let's say this. We have an entrepreneurial church planning model in our denomination. Maybe that's the reason we plant so many churches. The OPC doesn't require a church planner to raise any money. They're fully funded before they go on the field. They've got 3 years budget or so from day one, and they don't have to raise any of it. But they don't plant very many churches. I get that. But our model is such that church planners do spend a tremendous amount of time raising money. And so that is a problem. But I think we have a bad model there. And some of our young, generally it takes 4 to 5 years for a church plant to particularize. And what you have there, you have a pastor who is, in my opinion, who's operated like a bishop, the man for, again, 3 to 5 years. And I don't know, I think that affects some people permanently. And they have a hard time being a Presbyterian and operating as a Presbyterian.
I see that, Brad, though, as a defect in whatever the presbytery set up for that, right? So, the particularization
it's not the presbytery. It's not the presbytery. It's the MNA. It's our model right now.
No, it is, but you still have to, the presbytery has to agree to certain things in terms of how that plant's going to go in terms of like whether or not you're going to set up a commission or something like that, a provisional session or a daughter church. You've got different things like that. So if a man's left to himself and he's got to do all those things, then shame on, whatever model is set up for him. I agree that's a problem. That can become a problem. And even I've seen problems with certain people, even under a healthy session, there's sort of at least sometimes a youthful or an early thing, kind of an exuberance by some pastors, even with that oversight, to kind of push the boundaries because they don't realize kind of what they're getting themselves into, because there's a honeymoon phase in ministry I've seen a number of times with, people who are excited about the plant and all sorts of other things, and problems don't arise until later that could have been corrected if the person had a more mature outlook on terms of, making sure that the things they were setting up were going to kind of be durable, if that makes sense.
Well, your point about the mission of the church, I've been thinking about that the last couple of days as I considered coming on here. If we have, I think the three of us would all agree that what we call an ordinary means of grace ministry model is what we adhere to, or that's what the ideal is. And that means that the most important thing the church does occurs on the Lord's Day, and it's public worship. There are other things, but there's nothing more important than worship. Back to church plants. You have church plants that don't start worshiping for 2 or 3 years. I mean, I'm sure that sounds crazy to some people, but they say that if you don't have 100 people in your that you've sort of got attached to before you start worshiping, you'll never get bigger than that. It's a very strange. I'm sure there's studies and experts who have good reasons and justifications for this, but I can't relate to it. I think however you start is probably how you're going to finish, and if it's all about the city and social justice and transformationalism, it's going to have to keep on being that way. Well, what you use to attract people is what you're going to have to use to keep them. So I think it's better to have a humble view of the ministry of the church, a fairly narrow view that doesn't require you to start with 3 staff members on day one and a $500,000 budget. And there are a lot of church planning models that tell you that's the way you got to do it. You've got to have a worship pastor, director. You've got to have a children's director on day one. And the model is crazy to me, but it's all about the mission of the church. I think that could be the next debate in the PCA. Is what is the mission of the church? So,
just to use that to bring it back to sort of this concept you mentioned there, and I know this is a big theme for you also in Machen's Christianity and Liberalism. That sort of that last chapter, the exhausting nature of trying to solve every problem everywhere. And you had just mentioned, social justice and win the city and this and that. I mean, do you think some of that plays into the frustrations of pastors who want one model for their church, but they're placed in a model where the congregation wants maybe ordinary means of grace ministry, but their pastor wants more missional philosophy and mindset?
Oh, I know of a church plant that just, not in my presbytery, but that just totally flamed out and fell apart. Actually, it's sort of recovered now. But you had someone trying to plan a Redeemer-style city church in a mid-sized town that was not terribly sophisticated. We're talking about a southern middle-class town. And that model, in my opinion, was they tried to impose that, and it just didn't work. People want, I don't know about a lot of PCA churches, but what a good PCA church has to offer, in my opinion, besides doctrine, is worship. Worship that's regulated by Scripture. And I think a lot of people who are coming into NAPARC churches in the last few years, they want a church that does worship and doesn't shut down completely for 3 years because of a virus. But they all, the distinctive thing that we have to offer is biblical worship. Because where are you going to find it? You don't find it in the mega church. You don't find it in most independent Baptist churches. We should do what we're good at. And what's distinctive about the principle of the Reformation, the Calvinist Reformation, Calvin in the little pamphlet, Necessity of Reforming the Church, he puts worship ahead of doctrine. Now, he doesn't always do that, but he did. He says because there's a formative effect in worship on individuals and on families and on churches, but also it affects our doctrine of God. If we worship as if God is sovereign and holy and almighty and immense and immortal, our people are going to get the idea that's the way God is. And if it's something less than that, I worry about our theology. Theology proper.
Mm-hmm. Well, he talks about in the article this. I don't know if he's bringing social sciences in, but he talks about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and his mindset was the growth mindset, and the congregation apparently was the fixed mindset. But false dichotomies aside, I think, my background is from the business world. I was an engineer at P&G, and I've run businesses. And I'm always looking for employees that don't really want the job that they have. They want to make the job they have what they want to do. And I often wonder if that's what's going on with this pastor, or maybe some other pastors that are overly frustrated with the call they have. It's almost like they don't want the call they have, and then they don't want to leave the call they have, so they try to make the call they have the call they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, in this case, the fixed mindset that he's railing against are the few holdouts that actually seem to have believed in Christianity. Right. And when you read between the lines, he's impressed. Of course, honestly, I guess I've been around long enough where I've got enough degrees. I read a lot. I'm just not impressed with people who are impressed with themselves intellectually, and I can kind of see right through the holes of how in what shallow ways he's bringing things up. He even talks about in his sermon that he preached, agapeo always means the unconditional love of God. It's like you can't even, you're not even translating the Greek word right, because that's not true. If you even were doing half the job that you think you've done because you're an Oxford and Princeton grad, you would have figured that out. But, I guess the thing for me is that gets back to, again, what is reality? What are you going after? What is this ministry about? What are we trying to form in people? It kind of gets to this issue of pastoral care too, that I know we're going to talk about. And what are we doing with disciples? Because, when he's talking, it's all about me. Have you heard about me? Have you heard about how much was? But everything in the Christian life is about y'all. You all press forward. We press forward together. The head is no more important than the hand. Then can the eye say to the ear, I don't need you, and all this other thing. And everything for him is about what he did and all these other things. He never really expresses the fact that this idea that what he was doing was trying to push them forward, in the sense, because what we're battling against is sin and death. We're battling against principalities and powers. We're dealing with the world, the flesh, and the devil. And if you don't have that in your grid, then you're not then you're just off. It's just completely missing the mark. It's not even the Christian faith in terms of what that's the mission. It's worship and sacraments, prayer, but all of those other things that go into us pressing together and having to deal with death and all of the sorrows and all the other things. I mean, I was looking at my text today because we're dealing with a man who could be dying literally within a couple of days in our congregation. And how do we press forward? I mean, this is a saintly person that still, with all of his saintliness, in terms of just the seeming outward trust, still struggles with the sense of whether God loves him and that sort of thing. And how do you press forward with him? How do you walk forward with him and his wife and comfort him? How do you comfort a pastor who loses his daughter and his wife and his children who are dealing with that if you don't have the hope of the resurrection? How do you continue to stand? Not just and so all of this stuff is just so. All of these things about how he had to memorize sermons and how he had to bear all this stuff, to me is just so much dung, so much garbage compared to what the battle that we're up against. And I'm so tired of all of the therapeutic, how I'm feeling about things rather than dealing with the fact that, hey, okay, if you're struggling, then take a knee, we'll put a perimeter around you and protect you, but we're pressing in together. We're not going to leave anybody behind, but don't make it all about how hard things are you. What is your concern with respect to the way you're dealing with this that deals with how the people of God who are called by God are pressing forward against the gates of hell and dealing with these things? And any other discussion about how we're feeling emotionally and struggling with those things are interesting, but then back up and think about the group and then say, if you need our help, if you need our support, then we're going to circle around you. We're not going to make you carry the burden alone, but but remember what the mission is about, because we're on the march together. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. You were preaching, well, exhorting to Brad, but absolutely. And, in my own life, so I was an engineer and I am a driven person, not in military or anything like that, but I have a way of thinking it's all on me, and I have to fight that. And in God's grace, I'm 48. I'm learning. But what really struck me was I can't solve every problem in the church. I can't solve every person's problem, every property problem, I can't even solve all the problems in my own life, and it's because I'm not Jesus Christ. And once we remember we're not Christ, we can't solve these problems. And then also in our polity, like you just said, I love that the military imagery you just gave us of the session around their pastor, perhaps, or around any one of their brothers that needs them to
or
be
the
around.
Congregation as a whole.
Amen. And so, yeah, and I think really that is the power of Presbyterianism, and that's some of the sadness of this article is he's supposedly in a Presbyterian denomination, but this really, I think, is where the session comes in, and particularly the ruling elders, to help their pastor not feel like they're in it alone, and also reconceptualize how they're viewing certain things while taking serious the struggles of the ministry for the man. And so what are some, as we try to round it to that, the pastoral care of teaching elders, but it could be for ruling elders. What are some, because I think this resonated with so many in the PCA, and even guys that said, man, I see a lot of what he's saying, but he's missing the mark in all these areas. And even myself in reading it, I could see there were some insights there that resonated with me. And you guys remember, I'm still at a point where I was a ruling elder more than I was a teaching elder. So I know both sides of the coin. But I'm glad for a session that helps pull me back from devolving into what this guy is saying. So I really don't have a specific question at this point, just on what I just said. Is there any initial thoughts as we move into this part of the conversation?
Well, I think...
go ahead, Brad.
Oh, well, as far as ruling elders helping their own pastors. I think the hardest thing that any ruling elder ever does is correct or point out weaknesses to their pastor. But it's probably one of the most important things that you can do. And as a new ruling elder going in, don't be surprised that your pastor or pastors are sinners. And don't be surprised by sin in them either. You can't put them on a pedestal any more than you can put you can put your wife on a pedestal, but if you're me, otherwise you don't put anybody on a pedestal and think they're practically perfect. You shouldn't be surprised that every pastor, every man has weaknesses and struggles and imperfections. And
does that include Sean Morris? Wait a minute. Would Sean Morris admit to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. His wife could fill you in. Absolutely. I was sitting next to her tonight, so yes, no doubt. But knowing when and how to correct a pastor is very difficult, and I think. But I hear horror stories about sessions that abuse their pastors and run all over them. I've never been a part of that. I've been blessed to be in such a wonderful church, but it's just the dynamic makes it difficult to correct and but you want to encourage anytime you can, but I think it's in the heart of every person to sort of, two things: either just be passive and lazy and let things go, or to try to domineer. And we just need to fight both of those tendencies. I mean, that's what Presbyterianism is about. The plurality of elders means that no one person is in charge. I mean, the pastor, by virtue, I think, our BCO says, by virtue of his office, he's the moderator of the session, he runs the meetings, he sets the agenda in some sense, but he doesn't have any more ultimate authority, especially in voting and in the leadership of the church than anyone else. And we need to remember to be Presbyterians. We need to remember the plurality and the equality of sorts between the elders. And it's a challenge and a blessing. I mean, let me quickly, in case we don't have a lot of time, the ways to support a pastor is to be reasonable. You mentioned our associate pastor. They just had a baby. We've given him a sort of paternity leave. He's still preaching, but he doesn't have to come into the office for a couple of weeks. And that's not written into his, contract or his call, but we just saw that that's a good thing to do for him. You want to be flexible. You don't want to treat it like an employer-employee relationship. It's a family brothers relationship, and the pastor shouldn't take advantage of that, but neither should you take advantage of the pastor. So there's just all sorts of things you can do to be thoughtful and reasonable, and realize that the difficulty of the job and the very random times that that may be involved in. You middle of the night, weekends, Sunday. So you want to be flexible with what you require. You don't make them punch a clock. You try to be reasonable.
That's good. Those are great input. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. I mean, like, a number of things are swirling through my head. I think that, lest anybody get the impression that I don't think the ministry is hard, I think that, being a ruling elder or a teaching elder is impossible without the grace of God, without the indwelling work of the Spirit and that sort of thing. But there's also a togetherness that has to go with that. It's part of the call of the church constantly to be working together towards those things. And so, analogies fall down. But one of the things that Doug Kittredge, who's the pastor of New Life in Christ down in Fredericksburg, once said many years ago, is he said, one of the reasons he likes the session is because when he grew up, he didn't have any brothers. He would be hanging around his friends, and his friends would be trash talking their brothers, and then he would jump in and say, "Oh yeah, he's a real jerk," and then the guy would turn to him and go, "Hey man, that's my brother you're talking about," because it's one thing for me to pick on my little brother growing up, but it's another thing for anybody else to do that. And I think that if there's not, and that's obviously, you got to be careful with that analogy, but there is a real sense in which, the session should be taking care of each other in that sense, be watching out for each other. And if you're not watching out for your pastor, like I remember a while back, some person came and visited and wrote a note to the session telling us why he wasn't going to be attending the church anymore because he felt like the sermons weren't exegetical. So, nobody asked me to do it, but I basically took him down. I was like, okay. I was nice about it, but I was basically going to, you think you're impressed with yourself, but this was exegetical. And I found out afterwards, because pastors deal with these kinds of burdens, they get frustrated, like that maybe I really am not doing that. And then my pastor's wife said, "Don't worry." He's going to say, "Don't worry, Rich is probably going to say something at the time." And I did, because I'm not going to put up with that kind of stuff. Now, if there's things that I need to talk to the pastor about, I will. I also think it's healthy, if possible, for friendships to actually, natural friendships to occur within the session, to be able to have conversations, to be able to check in, to be able to have the kind of shepherding kinds of conversations about the pastor and his family as you would with other kinds of people, to be able to have those kinds of conversations so that it's not just, generic, but you really get to know the person and you're really, invested in their lives. And so, I think you all know that, our pastor's daughter died at the 1 year anniversary is coming up soon. And so I was asked to preach the funeral, and I got to tell you, I'm still overwhelmed by the burden that was, to the privilege given, or the trust given by the family to do that. But, he's my friend, like I said, Doc Holliday, when, in that one movie, goes like, why are you doing this? Like, he said, cause Wyatt Earp's my friend. He said, I've got lots of friends. And Doc Holliday said, I don't. And that's kind of the way I feel. I have a lot of really good acquaintances, but only a few tight friends. And he's one of them. And so, those are important things, because when you're dealing with those kinds of losses, he's a person just like anybody else. And when you've lost a child, all of this other stuff this guy is talking about is almost like, it's like, sign him up for that, because he'd rather have all of that stuff that person talked about, rather than dealing on a daily basis with the fact that he lost a daughter and his wife lost a daughter. And how do you endure in the Christian faith with the hope of the resurrection, knowing you're going to see your daughter again? It's because in reality, Christ is at the head and he's our captain, and we're looking forward, and he's pressing forward. And sometimes the formation march that's going on says, hey, we're going to carry your pack for a while. We're going to watch out for you. We're going to take care of you. We're going to watch out for you. And so I'm sad to hear about, if there's PCA pastors out there that don't have anybody around them in the church that would ever carry their pack, or their wife's pack, or their children's pack, or whatever, to show them the gospel isn't about their performance or any other thing. I grieve about that, but not because this guy wrote that article that doesn't express any of the hope of the resurrection, or the reason why we're able to press forward under suffering and that sort of thing. And so at the end of the day, if a session isn't really focused upon what the gospel is dealing with, I can't remember, you said it earlier, it was either you or Brad. I was even reflecting upon it just today, the fact that once you understand how horrible sin is, because I was listening to Bavink on this too. Once you understand how horrible sin is, and you were a sinner, and the fact that Christ has taken away the reproach of your sin and the power of the sin, that's pretty remarkable news. and the fact that you've got the hope of the resurrection. And so we're still battling sin and death and all that other stuff. But if you're not pointed at that, and you don't have people around you as a together, we're pressing forward together, and that head that's speaking for the congregation and preaching the word is so important. But he needs that encouragement. He needs that occasional pat carrying, just like everybody else. He may be falling behind in the formation too, because he's weary, and we're called to stand and endure. And sometimes we need encouragement to endure. And so, sessions, if you're not doing that, then you're failing. You're failing your ministry, because one of the people in your congregation, though he may not be formally a member of your congregation, his wife and his family is, but he's still close to you, and you need to be taking care of him. And you're failing as a session if he's not feeling that fact that people are behind him and supporting him.
Wow. Yeah, man, you just said it. You just said it all, and you made a Tombstone reference, which was great. And so thank you for
I love movie references.
I know that was a good one. And you listen to Bovink. One thing I try to help teaching elders understand, the ruling elder side of things. Like, you guys you work full-time jobs. If you're going to do church work, you're coming in on your off time, your free time. For teaching elders, if we have, night meetings, we might be able to sleep in the next morning if we don't have an appointment. And so I try to help TEs understand some of the struggles that REs have to do as they juggle their own lives and ministry. And but one thing I like to help REs understand, and I think you highlighted it well about being on the teaching elder side, is I got to say, when I was a ruling elder, there's something invigorating to me about pressing into difficult situations in the church. It was almost like there were times in my professional career, whatever I was doing, where work was frustrating. And I really would rather be focusing on this issue going on in the church. And that was driving me. And I didn't mind going in late for it. I didn't mind coming in Saturday morning and working with a couple or something. And because it was, I felt like it was purpose, right? But there also is a distraction from the 40 or 50 hour a week job that I'm working. And the thing is, once you come into the full-time ministry of a teaching elder, I wonder if there's just not an escape. Like, it's always there, And I think a lot of pastors, their life is their family and their ministry, and there's not maybe some other thing they do for self. And so I think ruling elders understanding what you just said, Rich, essentially is, treating your pastor as a human being who needs that brotherhood. I love the friendship reference you made. And sometimes I think even some ruling elders think their pastors are Superman, especially if they're type A. I'm a type A guy. I don't have a problem speaking hard things to the congregation, to individuals. And sometimes people can think that means I don't have my own insecurities. That almost like I'm an Iron Man or something, and nothing's further from the truth. I am as insecure as the next guy. The Lord has enabled me, and maybe it's time in corporate America or whatever he's worked in my life, to be able to do hard things and say hard things, but it doesn't mean it's easy internally for me. And have ruling elders understand that and then be in it with me. And then also to say they're willing to take it sometimes on my behalf, maybe like you did for that pastor with the sermon. I think I have a session right now that when we're dealing with hard things, they're concerned sometimes for my pulpit ministry if I'm the one who has to have the hard conversation with an upset congregant. And they're like, George, we'll handle this conversation and we'll shepherd this congregant, and you just be there to love on them and support them in other ways. And that's hard for me because I want to deal with it, But I don't know if you guys ever found that there's certain situations that you as ruling elders feel like you ought to protect your pastor, and so you or another elder deals with it so that pastor doesn't have to.
Yeah, I think that should be the case. If from a shepherding perspective as well, there doesn't need, there should be some kind of like saying of like, rather than just saying, well, this needs to get done, people need to, it's sort of like, well, somebody should be doing that. It's like, we have kind of a policy, like if you're excited about something, then you're the person that's probably going to have to be in charge of doing that, because the somebody that should be doing that is probably you, if you really think that that's important. And so I think that there's that. And I appreciate what you said, because there's a certain sense in which, even being remote from work, I can almost never turn off being like working all the time. So I can understand probably that full-time ministry, in terms of the burdens of that, feels like there's just never an end to it, because something you might be thinking about it, but then you're brought back into it. But I think that that's part of making sure that, as pastors are thinking about how they're training their session and the expectations on that, and even a healthy church moving forward, is making sure that those things, some of those things are being divided up, so that there isn't a sense in which everything's on that person, and that there needs to be a place for the pastor, somebody for him to be able to talk to, just to be able to have a conversation, to take his mind off of things, or to be able to express those things. And I know that's why a lot of pastors talk to each other, or have groups to talk, because they're dealing with things that REs don't necessarily understand with. But it sure would be helpful in a church, if the pastor can just sit down and have a relationship with an elder, to where the elder is able to ask him, hey, how's your daughter doing? How's your wife doing? Is she sleeping okay? And that sort of thing. And to be able to do that without feeling like, I don't really know if I know you that well. Yeah, kind of, the uncomfortable kind of thing. And I'm not saying that he needs to try and force that situation, but it should be it would be a nice aspirational thing for an elder to be able to be close enough to the pastor and his family to be able to have conversations, to where when they're dealing with things, they know who the person they're dealing with, and it's not just the person they see on a semi-regular basis.
Yeah, Rich. Brad, you got thoughts on any of that?
Oh, well, so, I'm a great goer to funerals, and I think, if your pastor's mother or dad dies, go to the funeral. Somebody should do that. That's just a very simple thing. Our one of our former pastors, I think I've been to the funeral of both of his parents, and that was after he left. It's just a simple thing. My dad, it seems like he's 83, and as I was growing up, he was a deacon in the Baptist church, and he also just knew a lot of people, and he went to a funeral or visited somebody in the hospital. It seemed like every night of the week. It's simple things. We had a pastor that had a child who had a very serious, near-death health problem, and we were all there. The whole session was there at the hospital, and you didn't have to tell us we needed to do that. That's just normal. So there's some very simple things you could do. Just, what you would do for anyone else, do for the pastor. But it's, and what Nick said about what Rich said about knowing the family and all that, that's good. They need privacy. You're not going to be right in the middle of everything. But you listen, and you just do you just do the right thing. It's not complicated. There's not a procedure manual or a process or instructions for everything. But I feel sorry for pastors that have two elders, or they're a 5-year non-particularized church planter and they don't have any. They've got a remote session somewhere. I really don't know how they do it. And that's why we really need to be Presbyterian. We really, it's the biblical model that you have a plurality of elders, more than one, preferably 3, 4, 5, 6 for a decent sized church. And there's a lot of work for all of them.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good. I'm just making that connection now, like more more literally the connection between a plurality of elders and being Presbyterian and the support that we each get. So it's not just a plurality of elders, that there's decisions are being made by more than one person, and so there's wisdom in a multitude of counsel, but it's the iron sharpening iron aspect of what it is to lock arms with other brothers who care about you, and that's what I've heard from both of you men. You care about your pastors and you care about your other ruling elders.
Our senior pastor is sort of he's an expert on the offices. He's sort of an authority on Southern Presbyterian ecclesiology, which is, much bigger on ruling elders and even the role of deacon than the Northern Church ever was. And he made an effort when he came here a good, 14, 15 years ago, to make the ruling elders more visible into, so most Sundays a ruling elder does the announcements and does the call to worship, and then the pastor will take over. But he knew that, he had been a Baptist. He grew up a Baptist. He knew he needed ruling elders, and he knew the church needed them. And so a good, the advice for pastors is, make your ruling elders, make them Presbyterian and teach them what their job is and how important it is, and respect them, because they're going to help you a whole lot, and they're going to, be able to delegate, have the deacons doing what they should do, and the ruling elders doing what they should do, and it's going to make your job easier, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. Any final words, guys? Anything we didn't touch on that we said we would, or you wanted to, or?
Well, it's just an honor to be with two preachers,
Thanks,
the pastor preacher and the ruling elder preacher. And look, yeah. I know Rich is a great guy, because we've got people in our church that knew him when he was just an officer in a Reformed Baptist church somewhere in the Pacific, way back in the Air Force days, or whatever Rich was.
Don't you dare ever call me Air Force. You're thinking of them who was in the Air Force.
It's nearly as good as Air Force.
That's like
my friends were in the Air Force.
I don't know. I like, if I was in a Christian. Yeah, I just want to close by saying I think, circling back, I think that some pastors probably lament that they don't have what they could have. They might have taken a call, and maybe the elders aren't what they hope they might be, and that sort of thing. So I can imagine it can be discouraging. I would just, hope that in their ministry and that sort of thing, they would just remember that what we're called to do is stand. We're not necessarily called to always. We're not necessarily called to change the world and that sort of thing. And sometimes it's helpful to know that the goal is that, contend and stand and don't fall down. And so, I think it's not healthy to look at what a person from another denomination is doing that, and to start, focusing on the bitter aspects of the call, because there's a lot of glory and a lot of praise to be had for the call to that. Paul in 1 Corinthians, I think it's 4:13, says that, we're the scum of the earth for the sake of the ministry. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the, once you know where your status is in terms of what the world sees, then that's helpful to know in terms of how the world's going to see you. And then you realize what the ministry's like. Paul never stops and says, I had to memorize all these sermons. You don't realize I had 3 or 4 PhDs and I'm still having to make tents, and all this other stuff. He sees all of these things as privileges for the sake of the church. And I think when you change your perspective sometimes about why you're doing that, because candidly, I don't know if it's an age kind of thing, but sometimes I get a little too pity party-ish. I'm just a ruling elder, but sometimes I feel like, I'm getting kind of weary of these kinds of things. So I understand some of the pressures. I've got my own things with other stresses and all that other stuff that have to do with balancing all those other things. But I've never found it useful to kind of just sit around and talk about how hard things are, or how bad it is to be who I am, because I always feel like, if anything, Christ has called me to an honorable service, and to think that I'm privileged to be able to do this with all of the tribulations that go along with that, far outweighs the difficulties associated with that office. If anything, I feel myself unworthy to do that, rather than despising the call and wondering how I'm going to deal with the pressures of it. The pressures that I place on myself have to do more with my sense that, I'm not as faithful as I could be, or that I'm complaining about things internally when I should be, putting certain thoughts to death and that sort of thing. So just press on, and some of these kinds of, common things to where we're just kind of venting all of these things aren't necessarily always healthy, but that's not to say that we don't need encouragement either. So, kind of balance the two together to where you're not trying to just give vent to the flesh about how hard it is, but you're also, looking for resources so that you're not all on your own, and you're feeling like there's others to encourage you along the way and say, hey, come on, press on, brother. The goal's worth it, that the people that we're ministering to are worth it. This is the flock of God, and it's worth all of the effort that goes into it.
Oh, amen. That is a good word. I think as we are wrapping up here, but just that I think it's going to get tougher. I don't think it's going to get easier. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people go into the ministry with some pie in the sky. They either want to be, this great preacher, or whatever it is. I mean, we all want to see miracles, and the call of ministry is the call to die for Christ and to carry the burdens of the congregation, and having a right view of the gospel, a right view of the resurrection. I love that focus that you guys brought up. A right view of calling in this, this is, I don't know, my fifth career, I guess. So I know what it is to be a teacher. I know what it is to be an engineer. I know what it is to be in corporate America and run businesses. And in some sense, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And I think if you don't have the right focus and view of the gospel, it is going to be drudgery and viewed as any other thing you're doing. And so, in the words of Brad, be a Presbyterian. And this was fun.
Don't be an Erdman.
Yeah, there you go. This was fun, you guys. I thank you for this conversation. Actually, it was Rich's idea a few months ago. He said he wanted to have a conversation with Brad.
Yeah, I wanted to be on with Brad because he's got such a cool, deep voice, and then my voice, so we kind of balance out to be a normal ruling elder together.
Right. Well, there you go. And I'm just a platform for you guys to do your thing. There, that's it. And so, of course, Brad didn't say it. I think it goes without saying, but he is the co-host of PresbyCast. What's your Twitter handle? The oldest
Well, I changed it. It used to say the oldest and biggest Reformed podcast. There was an asterisk, and the asterisk referred to do live chicken sandwich reviews on air. So we're not the oldest or the biggest, but we are the oldest and the biggest that focuses on food sometimes.
Fast food.
No, chicken sandwiches.
Oh, chicken sandwich. Okay.
Especially, I think the ones that are in gas stations, right, Brad?
It's been done. Yes.
Have you done Buc-ee's yet?
Yeah, I did the brisket taco, I think.
Okay.
On some trip.
There you go. The brisket taco. Very good. All right, gentlemen. This was great. I'll give you one more chance. Any final words? Well, that's it.
It's something I've been saying a lot the last year is that Presbyterian churches ought to be officer-led, not staff-led. Whether you're a small church or a big church, if you're so big you've got to have 100 professionals to make things work, you're too big. Staff-led usually means pastor-led in most churches, but it needs to be the officers. The plurality of elders working with the deacons for the good of church members, of people. That's what it's about.
Good word. Good word. And hey, by the way, did you guys see Fred Greco is teaching a polity class at Birmingham Theological Seminary? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yes. So they're doing good stuff over there at BTS. I give them a plug. They actually help sponsor this podcast. And so Birmingham Theological Seminary, if you're a ruling elder, there's great certificate programs at the master's level you can take. And if you're a pastor, I'm in a D-Min program that I'm absolutely blessed by. So thanks for listening to P&R Churchmen. Until another episode, thank you.
Thank you.